Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whichever the case may be, for all of you listening out there across the crazy planet Earth. Welcome to the second special summer edition of Vestiges After Dark. And I am your host, Bishop Brian Willett, coming to you live from the deep woods of western Georgia on this September 5th, 2023. Tonight, we've got a very unique show covering a topic we have never discussed before, and I am really excited to bring it to you. We have a brand new guest to go along with it, J.J. Johnson. He is going to be talking with us tonight about Second Temple Judaism. And we've never covered that, have we? It's going to be an interesting show. You don't want to miss it. Don't go away. Everybody, sorry, my screen was doing some weird stuff on me, and I was like, wait a second, that's not the screen that I'm supposed to have up. And it serves as a great distraction, and this is why I take the summers off, because if I do this all year round, I go crazy. But we have tried to do this special twice now. This is the third time, and it will be the charm.
It will definitely be the charm.
That's right. The first time was, we got called away to Ghost Adventures. So we had to reschedule it, and then change the guest date, and then bring up a new guest because we couldn't do it with the original guest for the summer. And then we were all set last week. We went live, and just as we were ready to start the show, lightning struck right outside that window right there, and literally hit the ground, and it definitely vibrated the whole house. And the whole electrical system went out, and it fried the switchboard for a short time. It took me a while to get it back, but it was unsalvageable at that point because we are on generator power, and it's just too risky to try to run a live show on generator power. So
you tried. You gave it the college try.
I did.
I always gave up and had scotch, so it wasn't a
total loss.
It wasn't a complete loss.
It was a loss for all of you, but I mean, we were just fine. So, speaking of which, we have something unique today. We have Japanese whiskey. What do you got for us tonight on the liturgical libation?
Tenjaku whiskey.
Tenjaku. All right.
This is a new product. I've never had it before, and supposedly it is made with water from the basin surrounding Mount Fuji, and the water's filtered through volcanic rock.
I like the sound of it already.
So it's supposed to be a very clean, crisp whiskey.
Okay.
It's got nutty with hints of green apple and fresh herbs, richly rounded with only a slight smokiness. Palate has a crisp presence, solid yet delicate, round yet smooth in the mouth, and the finish has some vanilla, and it gives way to a woody flavor that will linger.
Sounds fantastic. Now, see, we always crack the bottle before the show. We don't drink it necessarily,
sniff test,
but we always smell it. And I can tell you, immediately it smelled like fresh apples. It smelled almost like cider. So this should be an interesting experience. Japanese whiskey.
Oh, they've really, the Japanese perfect everything they do.
Well, it's its own thing. I mean, I know it's that people will put it in the same category as Scotch, but I think it's definitely its own thing.
Yeah, it's a unique thing.
Oh, wow.
Oh, yeah?
Oh, yeah, that's going to be wonderful. I think you're going to like that. I can already tell. All right, here we go. Wow.
You can really taste the
The apple
in
is
front.
very, very strong. So this is a new one, you said, right?
I believe it's fairly new out. It's new to me. I've never had it, and I've never seen it. But I saw it today on my... While I was picking up other wares. And
well, it's fabulous. Thank you for sharing that one. And
all right.
yeah,
Tenjaku
that's a
whiskey,
winner.
y'all.
Tenjaku, yeah. I can definitely get behind that. That was good stuff. Joining us also is from Tennessee is Brandon Milam. How you doing tonight, Brandon?
I'm doing pretty good. I'm glad the Vestiges is back, at least for one episode.
At least for one episode. Well, we'll be back. Our season starts, for all of you out there, our new season starts in 3 weeks.
Right.
Okay, that's going to be a full season all the way up to Advent. So you'll get quite a few normal episodes, and the first one's going to be an interesting one. We had a lot of feedback, and I know a lot of the audience wanted me to teach more and do more episodes where I would teach on a topic. I think some of the suggestions were sacred geometry, and I told Brandon, I said, I mean, I don't mind doing a show on sacred geometry, but I'm not teaching it. I don't know the first thing about that, so it's not going to be, I think, the right thing for me to teach. But I mean, I don't mind doing a show if you can find someone who can do it. But what I will teach about is psychic seduction. So our first episode of the new season in 3 weeks will be on psychic seduction. And what this is going to entail is I'm going to take you through my own personal metaphysical journey. I'm going to teach you a little bit about what it means, but I'm also going to talk about some things that some of you might not know about as to some of my history in working in metaphysics and whatnot, and how I arrived at where I'm at. And I'm going to go through some of my own personal experiences with that very thing, how seductive the psychic and paranormal phenomenon can be.
Oh, yeah.
And how dangerous that is, how easy it is to get caught up in it. And so we're going to go and detail that for a full 3 hours in 3 weeks. So you don't want to miss that one. The show page is already up there on the YouTube channel, so go ahead and subscribe and like it, and make sure you have notifications on, all that good stuff. It helps the channel, but it also helps you to not miss any of these episodes, because we're going to have a good season. I can promise you that. Also with us tonight, we got the full team. It's wonderful. From Australia, we have Father Chris Yates. How you doing tonight, Father?
Yeah, I'm doing well, thanks. As you can see, I'm at a holiday home I have access to, which is out in near Nelson Bay in Port Stephens.
Yes.
So, it's pretty beautiful here. You can see the sky is so blue it looks white on my screen.
Oh,
yes.
wow.
Well,
So
see,
it's,
it brings new meaning to the name of this show, because for you it really is after dark. It's like, you're at the point now where the night is far behind you.
True. Like I said on a previous show, this is the future, so
Yes.
I'll let you know what's going to happen.
It is
ahead
the
of time.
future. That's right. Yeah.
This is Wednesday, 10 a.m.
That's right.
But yeah, we had dolphins just by the shore,
Great.
rising up and down. Although my beloved loathes dolphins, so she's convinced that they're in a conspiracy to take over the world and kill us all.
Well, that's they're probably smart enough to do that. I think if they had hands, they could probably build technology and kill us.
I'm Team Dolphin at this point.
I don't know. The killer.
I too love Japanese. I love Japanese whiskey, but I'm on a coffee.
Yes. Well, at that time, I think that makes sense.
Yeah, for you, that's appropriate.
The only time I break that rule is when I'm on vacation. Then it's like I'll drink any time of the day. It does not matter.
Right.
But yeah. So anyway, we have a great show tonight. But before we get to tonight's topic, we're going to do questions from the ether. Now, we're going to go through our normal questions, but I want to save a little bit of time at the end of this segment to talk to you about another kind of spiritual thing that will sort of lead us in as a precursor or foreshadowing for the discussion in 3 weeks and in that first episode about psychic seduction. I'm going to talk about how you can tell the difference, because there is genuine psychic ability and then there is everything else. And most people are somewhere everywhere else. The genuine stuff is far and few between, very hard to discern, particularly if you're new to all this. It can be very difficult to sort it through. We're going to try to help you with that. But I'm going to talk a little bit about something that I've been working on for myself over the last several years, you might say, and came to a decision about this year, and we'll reserve maybe 15 minutes at the end of this segment to talk about it. So let's jump right in. It gives us a half hour to answer I think Brandon's got 3 questions for us. Let's go ahead and get started with that, and we'll see where it takes us.
All right, so the first question is from me. When I was doing some studying into the book of Revelations, in terms of the mark of the beast, is that describing the beast from the sea or the beast of the earth?
Okay, well, it's kind of it's kind of neither. We're talking about apocalyptic language, okay, and so this is a coded language that is an ancient coded language on top of it, that would have been very meaningful to the people that the message was being sent to, and obviously the people who were sending it, but was obscure enough and metaphorical enough that unless you were into that inner circle, you wouldn't necessarily see this as meaningful or anything. So if a Roman would have picked this up and read it, they wouldn't have really known that they were actually talking about the empire in a very derogatory sense. So it was kind of a way of talking about their state, and how, in the end, with faith, God was going to, basically eliminate the empire, which kind of does, actually, when you think about it. I mean, the empire does fall, and Christianity, I think, is definitely the catalyst for that. In some ways. I mean, in some ways, no, because there was a lot of political stuff going on. But, I think when you read Revelation, what the modern Christian doesn't seem to understand is that it's not about us today. Okay. The part about us that is in Revelation is the ultimate message. And that ultimate message is that, in the end, Christ returns. All of the disorder and disease and destruction that we have brought into the universe through the fall will be reconciled. And that is done through the elimination of this broken world, and it will be replaced with an entirely new one. And that is ultimately the theme of the Christian life, not just the book of Revelation, but the theme of the entire Christian life. And so that is obviously central to what Revelation's talking about. But the nitty-gritty details, like the beast and all this, are referring specifically to elements of the Roman Empire to early Christians. They're not applicable to us today. So it's kind of humorous to watch people turn it into some kind of apocalypticism that is, that like there's some secret code or secret message that Christians need to heed, and that the Antichrist is coming back, and he's going to come back as some like popular figure, and kind of like the what's that series with Kirk Cameron that you used to talk about?
Left Behind.
Left Behind. That's it. Thank you. Like the Left Behind series. That's nonsense. Okay. It was only in the last 200 years did that kind of thinking really take root in that sort of interpretation of the book of Revelation. Prior to that, that was not the church's understanding at any point. Even Protestants in the Reformation would not have recognized the book of Revelation to be speaking about things like that. I mean, yes, there's some prophecy to it in the sense that, like I said, we're heading towards this new direction. God's going to make everything right in the end. That is prophetic, and that is definitely a common theme inside the book of Revelation. But when you talk about like the beast, and whether it's the beast of the sea or the air, it's like, we were discussing this on the Nicolaitan Network, and we were talking about the beast with the 10 horns. And, what is that? And I think there are Christians out there that really think this is some kind of demon, when in reality, that is the Roman Empire. The horns in the ancient world were a symbol for absolute power, which is why, honestly, when you look at Baphomet. We've talked about the image of Baphomet, which a lot of Christians think is a demon or think it's some kind of satanic image. Even Satanists use it as such. Yeah, we have them on the wall over here. The horns, and that's where they get this devilish idea, but the horns are actually representations of connection to divine knowledge, because the horns ascend upward and it bridges the gap. It sort of like channels heavens into the individual. So horns were a sign of absolute divine power. And when you had a beast with 10 horns, well, 10 was the number of perfection numerologically. Okay, when you look at it's the number of completion. Okay, and so what you're talking about is complete absolute power. It was basically just a symbolic way of saying that. It's just one example, but this is all that imagery in the book of Revelation is referring to that. These are not things that are about to happen that we need to try to figure out. In fact, Jesus told us to do quite the opposite, that even he himself did not know when any of this was going to happen. Only the Father knows when it's going to happen. And that should be good enough for us. A people of faith shouldn't need to worry about things like the end of the world. What significance would that even have for a Christian? I mean, honestly, shouldn't have any, right? Because I mean, if you are a person of faith, then you're all set. Okay,
the point is that we're supposed to be expecting the end of the world to be now,
imminent. Yes.
So we're supposed to live and be prepared.
Yes.
For the final judgment. I mean, what the apocalypse or the book of Revelation is eschatology. So we talked about this on the show, although some time ago, really. But the end times, and the idea is that the end times are both now and coming. Mm-hmm. So they're simultaneous. And so in the book of Revelation, you have this description of the Roman Empire, and like you said, I mean, it would have been very, very obvious. It's a deeply subversive text. I mean, would have got him killed.
Oh yeah, I mean,
so they tried to kill him, of course.
Yeah,
and so
it was treasonous. It was a treasonous document.
Yeah, so you got this description of the hell that is this sort of the underpinning philosophy and the lack of faith, as a Christian would, or the proto-church would understand it, of the Roman Empire. And then you've also got the vision of the New Jerusalem, the new heaven, the new earth, and the final judgment to come. And so, and really, until the Reformation, when things go haywire, people had always had this, and I think what is right belief, that faith and works are important. And so at the final judgment, your right doctrine and your right actions will simultaneously, what you've done with those things simultaneously be judged. And in the life of the world to come, there'll be this renewed place where you'll be allotted your space within that new future reality. So, it's kind of a book that sets out eschatology.
Yeah, and that's why it's in there in our canon, because it still holds that theological value, but you really undercut all of its value, all of its intrinsic value, when you try to reduce it down to being some kind of like secret message for the people of the future, where they need to like figure it out and say, oh, I know Donald Trump, he's the Antichrist. He's got to be, that kind of thinking.
It's definitely not Gnostic.
No.
I mean, because of the author, it's definitely not a Gnostic text.
Right,
but people, like you say, they interpret it Gnostically. I mean,
they do.
Really, the Protestants did. I mean, describing the Pope as the Antichrist
and
all the rest of it.
That's true, yeah.
So,
and then his place in Rome also, that didn't help, being that the church did kind of take over the empire, didn't they? So I hope that answers the question, Brandon. Does it?
It does.
Great. What's our next one?
So our next one comes from Paula. She asks, how would you respond to the question, are you saved? Recently, this question has been flying around in my neck of the woods, and I would like to be able to answer it in the most respectful way so the people posting it will understand.
Well, that's an easy one. I would just simply say to the person, I don't know, go ask God. He's the only one that would know.
Like, I don't know, but I'm working on it.
I think, Jamie, you've nailed it. I think
I'm working on it.
My answer to that.
That's all anybody can say. I'm working on it. Yeah.
It's Metropolitan Callister's Ware's answer. I think I said on the show before, where he's traveling in a cassock, and he's probably one of the world's most famous theologians, and he's on the train, and this Protestant says to him, "Are you saved?" And he thought, well, if I say no, then he might ask why on earth I'm traveling around the countryside wearing a cassock. If I say yes, then I'm going against everything I believe, which is
it's a loaded question
of God's grace. Yeah. So he said the answer is I am being saved.
That's wonderful.
Perfect answer.
Yeah, I am being saved. Yeah,
absolutely.
And that's, I think, the only way to. I think I have a huge problem with the presumption and the arrogance of some Christians to think that this is something that they can somehow know, that this is something that they can be assured of, that that you can reduce salvation down to simply a simple action of belief. Right. I mean, that's very problematic for me. I don't have any I mean, I don't even entertain those kinds of questions, because really what it is it's bait. Nobody asks you that because they really want to know. They ask you that because they want to bait you into some kind of missionary activity that they think they need to take on, because
or they want to test your doctrine. Do you believe in works? Any role for works in salvation is really what they're getting at.
Right.
And
but then again, like you've said before, Father, I mean, by reducing it down to saying that I confess that Jesus is my Lord and Savior, then that's a work.
Absolutely. And it's also a reductionist work.
Yeah.
It's a reductionist work.
It is.
Because right faith is the entire creed.
Yes, correct. So, I would say that don't even entertain the question. Don't give them an in, because it's a bait. It's always a baited question. Nobody ever asks that with sincerity. It's always because there's an ulterior motive.
Unless you're willing to engage on that level that we just done.
Yeah.
If you've got a small and fragile faith, don't engage in that.
Don't engage in it. Yeah.
And by the way, there's nothing wrong with the faith of a mustard seed. Is great. So I'm not saying that in any pompous way, but what I'm saying is that there are different roles in the life of the church. Some of us have. We've been given the time and opportunity to be able to make these arguments. But the other thing I'd say is no one has ever been saved through argument. Jesus didn't argue with anybody.
Sure didn't.
Not really. No, he would just. No, he didn't argue.
Are you the Messiah? What do you say?
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
How can you forgive sins? Well, is it easy for me to say be healed or your sins are forgiven?
Mm-hmm.
Whatever. He's not arguing. No one's ever saved by argument. Not really. I mean, we enjoy it. Sometimes I love a good argument.
Oh, I know you do.
If that's not your bag, don't do it. Just say.
I have to be in the mood for it. If I'm in the mood, I will definitely argue, but most of the time I don't have the energy for it. So yeah, Brandon, I think that's really the only approach. I mean, you take your pick. You can just be straightforward and be like, but ultimately, it is a question that only God can ever answer. No one can ever answer that about themselves.
I'd agree with that, especially since I've grown up hearing people saying, "Oh, well, I go to church, so I'm saved. I know I'm going to heaven." That's the thing I've heard the most is "I know."
Yeah. Well.
Wow.
It's
presumptuous.
Pretty damn arrogant. Yep.
I've heard it all. Growing up, I grew up in the South as well, and not quite the South that you grew up in, Brandon, but still. A lot of that came into Florida, and even though Florida is a very different place today than it was when I was a kid, it was a lot more Southern in the 80s than it is today. But there was a lot. I mean, the religion of Florida, or I should say the way of practice in Florida was very much the same as what you described. So I'm very familiar with it. All right, what's our next one?
So the third one comes from Andrew. What really is the unforgivable sin against the Holy Spirit?
Oh, I love this question, because this is one that gets a lot of people riled up. The interesting thing is sometimes people will use this one as a way to try to trip you up and say, God's not really all forgiven because doesn't it say that in the Bible that, he won't forgive this one? And I've heard all sorts of people come up with all sorts of loony ideas as to what it is. And it really is the most simple thing, but it is also one of the most beautiful things, because it actually, when people try to use it as a way to undercut your theological position, once you reveal what the actual answer is, they realize that they just actually put their foot in their mouth by asking it in the first place. Essentially what this is, okay, what the unforgivable sin or the blasphemy against the Holy Spirit is the unwillingness of the individual to accept the grace of the Holy Spirit. So what makes it unforgivable, okay, is that you can't be forgiven if you willfully choose to reject the grace that forgives you. There's no way around that. God's never going to violate your freedom. So the only way God's forgiveness cannot reach you is if you outright reject it. And that is an absolute, complete blasphemy, because that violates everything that you were created for. Because it's the ultimate violation of the will of God. Because God understands you're going to screw up. God understands you're going to make all sorts of mistakes. But God expects that you will work towards your redemption, which means forgiveness is a huge part of that. And so the Holy Spirit is present for us physically in the sacraments of the church, and predominantly in this particular case, the sacrament of reconciliation. When a person absolutely refuses to be forgiven, refuses to seek that grace, then how can the grace of God reach them? Because God's not going to do it for you. He's not going to violate your freedom. You have to willfully choose. So that's what makes it unforgivable. Not that God's somehow limited in power, but that you limit what God is able to do in your life when you refuse that very grace.
He won't save you from yourself.
He will not. No. He lets you do, even if your freedom is so important to God that he will let you destroy yourself if that's your wish. He will let you do it. And you might say, well, that's horrible. No, it's not. It's absolute freedom. And that's the only.
There's a great. One of the prayers for the dead in the Orthodox Liturgicon is. There's a great. I only heard this last Sunday because I was at a Greek Orthodox church and the priest was praying for this recently departed person. Yeah. And the prayer. The Orthodox are so much better at this. The prayer was basically asking for the forgiveness of sins and saying, because nobody can live without sinning, which is like that. And the context of that is the absolute leveler of that, and actually it's reassuring. Mm-hmm. Like that because we're not a Gnostic faith, it's not that like we have to reach a level of perfection in our lives.
Right.
There's just a forefronted acknowledgement that we can't actually live without sin. And of course, the greatest sin is the unlived life. People that don't do anything for risk of doing something wrong. I mean, that it's an awful way to live. That's not the Christian way. The Christian way, and the gospel passage that is the mirror of what you said about the sin against the Holy Spirit, which includes apostasy. It includes, because that's a lack of willingness to believe in who God is.
Well, you're also cutting yourself off from the life-giving Spirit. So yes, I mean, obviously it can extend out. Yeah.
But the gospel passage that speaks to that is that the door is the handle's only on your side. That when Jesus says the door's not locked from heaven's side; it's locked from your side. It's up to you. And like you say, that's what free will means. Your free will can lock that door, mm-hmm. and God won't. God won't break it down.
No,
but your free will can also open it up, mm-hmm. and therefore the sin against the Holy Spirit. I mean, one of the definitions of hell is that it's eternal self-unforgiveness. Mm-hmm. That you can't forgive yourself, and it's an eternal kind of self-condemnation mm-hmm. for having rejected divine love.
Yeah.
And that's where a lot of this demonic stuff comes from. People who think they're demonically possessed. It's actually just their own trauma and self-hatred mm-hmm. and their own sin eating them up.
We see that
which is
all
demonic,
the time.
Really, in a way.
Yeah.
I think people have really you get two types of lunacy out there. You get the people like we first talked about in the second question, that think that salvation is just this simple matter and that they've got it and, you don't because they're the special ones. Okay. And then you get the other group that feels that they're beyond forgiveness, that they're so horrible that God would want nothing to do with them. And they're both equal lunacy in different directions.
They're both ego and pride.
Yes, it is. Correct.
They're both ends of it. That Jesus died only for me. Yeah. Or that Jesus died for everybody except me.
Yeah.
It's you limiting God.
Well said. That's well said. Yeah, well said. I mean, that's what it is. Now, I've heard I got into a fight with someone once about this. Now, I did argue about this one because I get asked this question at least 3 or 4 times a year in different ways. And back when I was on Twitter and very active there, that question came up a lot. And even prior to that, when I was before Twitter, on Twitter, I was very active on Facebook, and it came up there too. And somebody who followed me on Facebook said, "Oh, no, you're wrong." And I said, "Well, first of all, okay, I'm not giving you my own personal interpretation here. This is I'm just repeating to you what the fathers of the church have said about this topic. Okay, so if you've got a problem with this, you can go and argue with them, and I guarantee you they understood theology better than you will in your best day. In a million years, you'll never get it as well as the fathers of the church did. I don't even know if in today's time we're even capable of the level of sophistication and thought that they had back then. There's just too many distractions today. Our minds are on too many different things. I don't know if we can ever have the clarity of thought that the fathers of the church had. But this is not my, people, when you give a statement as a bishop, it's kind of a humorous thing to watch, but when you give a statement as a bishop, everyone always thinks you're giving your opinion. I don't give my opinion. I mean, unless I specifically say, in my opinion, this is what this means, then you can almost always assume very confidently that I am sharing with you a broader teaching that is much older than I am from a person who's a lot smarter than I'll ever be. Okay, I can guarantee you that.
The problem is the democratization of things within the church. I mean, democracy is it's the least bad option for civic life. But the church is not a democracy; it's a kingdom. And this is what I wasted so much of my time, especially when I was an Anglican. And this is the great sin of Anglicans, is that they argue over doctrines that are not theirs to argue about. So they waste all of their time in these stupid squabbles and arguments about things that really aren't up for debate.
Right.
They just think they are. And so they spend all their time arguing about women bishops and gay marriage and all the rest of it, instead of getting on with actually, going and loving people and presenting Christ to the world in such ways that they might respond to that invitation. And it drives him. And now it looks like the Roman Catholic Church are going down the same road with this synodal way and all the rest of it.
Of course.
Which is why independent Catholicism and Orthodoxy are really far more appealing, and people should really respond to that.
I mean, really, and that's the problem is that they've given Christianity, and by us, I mean Christianity itself, such a bad name that, even people that might have been able to thrive within it, would have been people of great faith, have chosen to reject it on the basis that what they have available to them is so horrible to be involved when they don't want anything to do with it. And I mean, and unfortunately, the independent movement is difficult. It's far and few between. It's hard to find. It's so underfunded that you might find a local priest, but does he even have a church where he operates? I mean, who's going to want to offer up their home? I mean, people today, you can do it the old way. I used to do it the old early Christian way, but it created a lot of problems. It created a lot of problems bringing people into your home, watching people disrespect your home, watching people disrespect you and your family. Eventually, you get to a point where I've had enough. and so no, I don't open my home up and like that anymore. And that's a huge loss.
Your home should not be a place of stress. It should be a place of peace.
Correct. And particularly if you're opening your house up to be a church,
right.
Then you think that peace would even be greater.
Well, there should be a whole nother level of respect, but sometimes there just isn't.
There just isn't. In our particular case, I did it for a while, and it became the typical politics that you see when too many people get together. Everyone vying for power and position. It's the same parish politics, but it was happening in my house.
It's actually... But it's inevitable.
It is.
And it's inevitable in any organization. The book of Genesis tells you why.
Yes, it does. And that's also why you need to have a public church so that it doesn't happen in your home.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
Not least because, and it's interesting that the whole house church movement has had to, people have to learn in every generation, don't they? But the function of a neutral space. In fact, it's not a neutral space; it's God's space.
Yes.
But it's not a place where anybody claims. Well, they don't sleep there, And so the function of that is that it gets us away from the "my house, my rules" kind of attitude, because we can't help it. If you're in your place, then no matter how altruistic you are, the dynamic is that it's your space, and therefore you get to decide what happens in that, and that's why. A church building, I'm sure JJ will talk about the role of the Second Temple, which was a similar kind of role.
Well, and that's why we're covering that, because it is so interconnected in what Christians think they understand about themselves. You really need to understand that foundation to really know who you are if you consider yourself Christian. But anyway, I'm sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
And also a place that's set aside for God. So it's not that. A church building is a magic place. We don't believe that. But it's a place where people only gather in the context of divine worship and in the sense and in the deliberate entering into holy ground. Mm-hmm. So that's what sets it apart. We believe that the Blessed Sacrament is present there, and therefore Christ is present in a particular way. But it operates on a psychological level as well as a theological level, where we're saying this is a space that actually is where no human being, none of us, have primacy. God has primacy, and then within the authority structures of the church laid out, bishops, priests, and deacons, that yes, there may be a bishop or a priest that locally leads that worshiping community, but they don't own the space. Right. God does. And it's very clear. I've been in very structured parish life where, the traditional sort of, these post 1500s approach to sacred space. It's very obvious, although the parish priest is the parish priest and nominally in charge of the worship community, the building is not his. Right. And he doesn't think it is, and no one thinks it is. And so it can be a place where even if they don't like the parish priest, they can go and pray.
Yes. Yeah. And that's that's the ultimate goal. But see, unfortunately, in the independent movement, finding that is hard for people, and it's not prolific at all.
It's expensive.
It's expensive, and there's not enough support. And that's the other side, is that in independent Christianity or independent Catholicism, the support that you receive is very far and few between. Honestly, if I wasn't on television, I don't think this church would have almost any support. It really is the fact that at least I'm out there and people have seen my work, and they believe enough in the work that I'm doing that they're like, well, if the church is the way that he does it, then I need to support the church. But, we'll never have the resources of the First Baptist, church, or or the Church of England. It's just not going to ever happen.
But you also don't have their problems either.
Thank God for that.
It's a wager. It's a wager. Yeah.
I don't know if I could handle. No, well, if I had that, I would delegate. I would be the most orthodox kind of bishop you could, where it's like, do not trouble me with the administration. You guys do that. I'm going to go pray. Okay. I'll see you later.
I'm off to Mount Athos.
Yeah, that's right. Off to Mount Athos. Yeah, the bishops don't do administration in Orthodoxy. That's what I love about that. But anyway, so that answers the question, Brandon. Now, I want to take some time here to talk to you about some things that are going on here, and want to share with those of you who might not know about it. But in 3 weeks, I'm going to do the show on psychic seduction. I'm going to talk about some events in my early life that were very influential and taught me a lot about how the paranormal and metaphysics works. And you might wonder, well, how do you know some of the stuff that you talk about? Well, I'm going to share with you part of how I know those things because I've experienced them. And I've been through the trial and error, and I've made the mistakes, and by the grace of God, I came out of it. So I understand the culture of it, if you will, and finding the genuine is very, very difficult in the midst of all of the illusion that surrounds things like metaphysics, the supernatural, the paranormal, the spiritual, the metaphysical, all that stuff. But I've had, as I went in my journey, and as a lot of you know, I was not always a Christian. I was not always a Catholic, or I would bounce around. I'd start out as one and then leave and then come back and then leave and then come back. So Christianity was never very far from me, but there were times where I would not have considered myself to be Christian, and I wouldn't have considered myself to, I never outright rejected the worldview, but I just saw it as just one of several that I could embark upon, and not really thinking that it was any better than any other. Perhaps I might have even thought it was a lot worse than some other ones. So, I played around with it. But in that exploration, it opened me up to exploring aspects of my spirituality that I didn't know that it existed. As a Christian, I would never have even explored those things. It wouldn't have been anything that I would have looked at. So part of that exploration was, the deep study of the occult, and so I became very knowledgeable in these arenas, particularly as it applies to applied metaphysics. But I was never really I was never a ceremonial magician. Right? I didn't join any of those little secret societies like Golden Dawn. No, I never did anything like that. But I was fascinated by them. I would study them, but I wasn't a part of any of those communities, and I'm glad I never joined them. Although they interest me, it's just not something that I would want for myself. And I'm not saying that they're bad or anything. I'm just saying that it wasn't for me. But one of the things that I was able to do is I had started to explore meditation. I had discovered Buddhism. I was starting to take Buddhism very seriously. And for anybody that knows anything about Buddhism, meditation is fundamental. So I wanted to get very good at meditation. And I found that I actually had a sort of a predisposition towards being having an effective path towards it. It just was something that my brain responded to very well. So it wasn't hard for me. I do have a very singular focus when I apply myself. And so meditation is very easy for me because of that. I can very easily tune out the rest of the world and not be distracted. It's not hard for me to do. So I found that meditation came easy. But what I wasn't prepared for is just how profound those realizations would get and how quickly they would come as I progressed in it. That I was not prepared for. And some of the things that went on were really kind of shocking, initially a bit disturbing, but as I allowed myself to be comfortable with it, if I could get myself to not react to any kind of defensive response to some of the things that were going on, then I realized that a whole new world opened up. And so that was the hardest part, not the meditation, not having the realization. It was trusting. It was because I've never been a person that easily trusts. Okay. It's something that, I like whatever I trust. I like it to prove itself to me before I trust it. I've always been that kind of person. But anyway, I I was meditating one night. This is around the time of the Hale-Bopp comet. So it would have been like 1995, I think, 96, something like that. And,
I remember that.
Yeah. And it was an interesting time spiritually. I mean, I do think that the Hale-Bopp comet did have some kind of spiritual effect on people. I think
I'm originally from a village called Hale. So
there you go.
Hale-Bopp was a big thing.
Oh yeah. Okay. Well, there you go. But I remember going out I was living in a high rise at the time, and I remember going out on my balcony and looking up and seeing it in the sky, and being like that, just kind of looking at it and being fascinated by it. And that night I went to meditate, and I very quickly fell into this very deep state, where I had an experience, and it's very hard for me to put to words what I saw, what I experienced, but to keep it simple, because I don't really have a lot of time to tell the story. I found that I could sort of astrally project, for lack of a better way of. I don't really like that terminology because it's a bit convoluted and it's a little bit deceiving. But for lack of a better way of explaining it, I experience an out-of-body kind of experience. And I found that I could do this on command. I could just put myself into meditation, I'd pop out, and I could see things. So I wanted to try to see if it was real, or if it was like a dream or some kind of thing. So what I would do is I would try to go into, because you can go through walls in these experiences. And I went up to the unit above me in the high rise. And I remember going through the floor and looking around to see what it looked like and trying to find an object that I could lock onto. And then, being the crazy person I was back then, the next day after this happened, once I found, I think it was a picture on the wall of a particular thing. I don't remember exactly what it was, but I just remember there being a picture on the wall that I knew if I could see that, then I would know that it was real. Mm-hmm. So I went up I knocked on the person's door, and I didn't know. I knew what I was going to say. I was going to say, I think I have the wrong unit. I'm so sorry for bothering you, but it gave me enough chance to look inside to see if I could see that picture. And I did this, and it worked perfectly. The person absolutely believed that I had made an honest mistake, and the door was open long enough because they started asking me like, well, what, where are you from? I said, well, I'm in the unit below, but I was coming up here. I don't remember the whole story. I had a whole concocted story of this. This is years, like I said, years ago. But sure enough, in the back was the picture on the wall. So I knew it was real. I knew it was real in that moment because I had seen it. Okay. And I had never been up there before. So I knew that, what I witnessed in this was actually me going through. So then I found that as I started to get better at this, it started to happen on its own. And then it got really deep. And when it was happening, it would happen when I was sleeping. And so one day I had a full witch's ride kind of experience where I woke up, but I could not move, complete sleep paralysis.
I've had that happen. Woo.
And then I started feeling this loud vibration and hearing this loud vibration, like a swishing sound, very loud, almost frightening feeling, and then pop out. And then this time, instead of popping out into my bedroom where I could float around and go into the other units in the building, this time I found myself in some kind of ethereal space. So truly like the astral world, I think what New Agers would kind of call this. And in that moment, I found that I could basically do whatever I wanted. If I wanted to see the moon, I could just think of the moon and I was on the moon. If I wanted to, eat lobster, I would be sitting at a table eating lobster and I could taste it, and it was every bit as real as my talking to you about it right now. So it was a profound thing. So one time this happened, and the one thing that I've always regretted in my life more than anything is that I always wish I had taken up a musical instrument, but never did. I was always angry at myself for having never studied music. And I know why I didn't. I mean, I had parents that wanted to get me a violin and piano, all this stuff. But I knew that they'd spend all this money and then I'd be obligated to it. And then when I want to go play outside with my friends, I would be having to be stuck inside messing with this instrument where I would grow to resent it. And so I remember having a conversation with my family about this and saying, I never want to resent music. And I know I will if I'm forced to do it. So I'd rather just never learn it, even though I regretted that as I matured in life. Yeah. And I regret it very much. So I never studied anything, but the one thing that I always wanted to study first was piano. And this never did. So in this moment, I had this extreme experience where I popped out into this ethereal realm where anything you think becomes reality. I said, I want to compose a symphony like Beethoven. I want to be able to compose music. And so instantaneously, it was as if the entire realm around me started to form and shape into various notes, and I could understand the intricacies of every aspect of it. Musical theory, the foundation, every element of music was completely laid bare to me and just easily understandable, as easy as, you know, singing the ABC song as a 5-year-old. It was just simple, and it was just immediate. I just knew. And so I came out of it, and for a moment I could still do it. I could still hear the music I was writing. It was the most amazing music I ever wrote, or I mean, ever heard, rather, never wrote. Most amazing music I had ever heard. And I wrote this myself, and I understood it. I could have actually started to pen it down, and never having studied music was all there. So this I continued to play with a while, and it got better, but I could never hang on to it for more than a few minutes. So one day, my friend, we were going out to dinner, and he was the curator at a museum down there. And he said, I need to stop at the museum to pick up something in my office before we go to dinner. Is that okay? I said, yeah, that's fine. I'll come in with you. So went inside, and they had this grand piano in there. And because they had like functions and everything else, it's a museum, right? And so we went into the back to his office, and I'm just in the main room there with that grand piano. And I just sat down at it, and I started looking at it. And for a brief couple of minutes, it all became clear to me. It's like I just knew what to do, and I could start playing it like a master pianist. And I was just going crazy with this piece that I had been writing in this astral kind of experience. And it was the most beautiful thing. And I was playing it perfectly, never having touched a piano before in my life like that. And he comes out, right? My friend comes running out. He says, I didn't know you could play the piano. I said, I didn't either. Right? But I lost it instantly. And after that, I could never really get it back again. So I always wanted to be like, can I ever do that again? Could I ever get back into my, whatever part of my brain unlocked that information? Could I ever access it again? Is that still available to me today? Now that I'm, a lot more responsibility than I had back then, a lot more distractions, a lot more stress. Can I still do it? I don't meditate anywhere near like I used to. Okay. So I told my students that I was going to go and buy myself a mid-range, higher end, one step between the highest mid-range and the lowest high-end keyboard. I didn't want to get like a piano because what if this fails? Mm-hmm. At least I could like live with the cost, or I could sell it or something. So I bought myself one, and I did it with the intent not to learn to play, not to take lessons or to buy. I bought this thing back in March, February or March, somewhere around there. And I just sat there and I said, can I do this? And I started it, and it sounded like like a baby banging on the keys. It was horrible. So then I started trying to meditate a little bit. Okay. And trying to reconnect with that reality that I experienced all those years ago when Hail Bop was in the sky. And suddenly something clicked. Only for a brief moment again. But this time I was able to take it and actually work with it. And so while I was clunky, I wasn't like this, master pianist like it was that night in the museum. I was like, wait a second, I'm kind of almost like remembering, kind of like, not quite like riding a bike, but sort of like I've done this before. It felt familiar. Mm-hmm. And then I was like, can I write a piece? Can I do this actively now in a conscious state? And for, again, a brief moment, it all became clear and I was able to do it. Now, this is not something I can just do on command. I have to work towards it, and it doesn't always produce an effect. Like I said, I've never studied music a day in my life. I never studied an instrument. I never really had an instrument. I mean, I had a little, cheap keyboard that I used to play around with, but I never played it.
I think everybody had a Casio keyboard.
Yeah, it was a Casio. Yeah, it was. It was like a cheap Casio keyboard just for fun. But I mean, I didn't do anything with it. This is a professional instrument that I have. And then I was able to create a piece of music. And so I documented this on my Instagram and on my Facebook, and I showed the process. And in 3 days I had written a song and lyrics and all. And I played it. And while my playing is not as good as it was that night at the museum, when I connect to this reality, I can play it, and I can play it quite well. But I'm not a musician, so I can't just be like, oh, let me go and play this, or let me go and play that. I have to figure those things out. But this just came to me. So for the break, I am going to share with everybody now the completed version of the song that I wrote. I wrote this, it was this month, right? So this was about like 3 weeks ago, three or 4 weeks ago, I started this.
Yeah, the whole thing, I think, has been about 3 weeks.
Yeah, so and I took 2 weeks off because we went away. Yeah. So this has been basically about 4 days work. I have no musical training. I've never studied piano. I've never studied music, never did anything like this. This is just strictly a spiritual exercise. So, again, for those musical experts out there, you'll probably hear the flaws in my playing. But I think it can show that we can definitely reach into a deeper reality if we can connect to the true essence of that reality. So for the break, I'm going to play you this piece of music I wrote in 3 days. And it was this month that I wrote it. August. I'm sorry. I wrote it in August. So this is called Guiding My Way, and listen to it. We'll talk a little bit about it when we come back, and then we will get to tonight's topic with our guests. Don't go anywhere. We have a fantastic show for you tonight. Welcome back, everybody, to the second part of Vestiges After Dark. We're getting ready to start tonight's topic on Second Temple Judaism. I think you're going to find it really interesting, particularly if you do practice the Christian faith. There's a lot of foundation there, a lot of context that is lost if you don't know about how it all got started. So we're going to discuss that, and I hope you enjoyed my little piece of music there. I'll talk briefly about it before we get to tonight's topic, and then you can kind of give me some insight into it. But don't go away. We'll be right back. So for you piano snobs out there, I actually tune my piano to 432 hertz. I don't use 440. So it means I probably can never play in a band, but I prefer the sound of 432.
I do too.
I think
loads of bands playing 432.
Really? Well, that's good to know.
Nirvana did, Guns N' Roses did.
See, they're smart.
Chili Peppers do.
There's something spiritual about 432, but I know that the diehards will say I'm wrong. The diehards say it has to be 440.
Well, you played both for me, and 432 definitely was a whole nother feel.
It feels different, doesn't
Right.
it? Yeah,
Absolutely.
It does. It feels different. And
There's some great YouTube clips of people playing 440 and 432 parallel.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
They're worth listening to.
Definitely. Well, okay. So, Mystic in the chat room, Danielle, who's a big part of the church, of a volunteer and helps with the office, also a student of mine. She and Joy Keeling are going to be, Joy from the earlier seasons of Vestiges, are going to be working on some vocals. Okay, I wrote the lyrics to it. I gave them the lyrics. I sang it for a while, although my voice is not capable of the key that this is in, but it gave at least an idea as to how it's supposed to sound with the proper singer. I also have another friend who I've written music with before in the past who is going to work on it as well. So we're going to have 3 vocalists, people that can actually sing this stuff, that will work with it. And I have some backtrack for a pop version that they're going to play around with, and we're going to see what works, what doesn't work. And once I hear what they've done, then I can make some changes. But it should be interesting. So this is not the end of the song, but that's the piano version that you heard. That's the first one. And, people are like, when are you going to write your next one? I don't know. It's when I ever connect to something else, because it's a connection. It's not really musical talent. I'm making a connection to something. It's more like a remembering. And we're going to talk a whole lot more about that in 3 weeks on the first episode. Okay. So, you're going to find that this is going to be a journey, and it should be an interesting journey at that. Okay. So, enough about the song. You can always let me know what you think. Just send an email to the church, office@nicoland.org, and I'll be happy to see what you have to say. But we have a fantastic brand new guest tonight with a fantastic brand new topic. Tonight, we are delighted to introduce our guest, J.J. Johnson, an individual whose multifaceted expertise spans from theology to technology. Born in a quaint Tennessean town of merely 113 residents, J.J. developed an early passion for folklore, captivating local audiences and intricate ghost stories. His intellectual pursuits led him to Harvard University, where he earned a master's degree in theological studies with a specialization in ancient Semitic languages. Intriguingly, JJ's academic interests also extend to Japanese language and culture, focusing particularly on the study of the yokai monsters or the Yuri spirits of Japan. Despite a prolonged and successful career in the technology sector, he founded the Southern Demonology podcast in 2017. Through his platform, JJ continues to conduct exhaustive research and disseminate knowledge in the arcane yet enthralling fields that have fascinated him since his youth. I think this is going to be a new guest that we're going to want to have on again. And in fact, we already have him scheduled for later in the season to talk about Japanese spirits. So
I was about to say, we got a Goazon to talk about.
We need to talk about the Goazon. That's true. That's true. But welcome to Vestiges After Dark, JJ. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
Yes, welcome.
It is a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, no.
Sir.
Well, we appreciate your patience too, because, when lightning struck last time,
Oh my
I
God.
hate inconveniencing a guest. It's one thing when it's just an open topic show. We can just kind of jump right back in the following week. But it's
that wasn't the worst thing. The worst thing was he was left with me on the group chat. So I bet he's here for half an hour.
I bet you did. I know Father Chris can talk.
Oh, we had a great conversation. Father Yates and Brandon and I, it was a really good time. So yeah, there was no inconvenience whatsoever.
Well, that's wonderful. I'm glad to hear that. So anyway, I guess let's start off. When we always have a new guest, I always like to ask, how did you get into what really was it that motivated you or inspired you to pursue the topic that you're going to share with us tonight?
It is a very good question. So I went to a tiny liberal arts college in the backwards of Virginia, which is actually just roughly 1,000 guys in the woods. And I started off by going into physics and philosophy, because I arrogantly told myself, I want to know about the metaphysical and the physical, and then realized that my math skills were not nearly up to par. So went over into religion instead. I thought that was a perfect comparison to philosophy, and they had 3 different tracks in that religion department. It was world religions and theology, and then finally biblical studies. Well, I first went to world religions, really loved it. Then took a tour over into theology because it's a perfect pairing to philosophy. But then one day I was passing by a bulletin board and saw a sign-up sheet for biblical Hebrew. And I went, that sounds really interesting.
Yeah.
So I signed up for it, started taking it. And then that led into a lifetime obsession with Semitic languages. But then my college actually was the first university in the country to offer a course on the actual Dead Sea Scrolls Hebrew.
Oh, wow.
And I got to see it from outside the curtain, because for 40-something years, there was a very strict embargo on the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yeah.
Only a very few select universities had access to them. In fact, there were so many horror stories of professors who had spent years working on research, and then they would come into a conference excited to talk about it, only to be upstaged by the quote-unquote rock stars who would come in with some new textual piece of analysis and just suck all the air out of the room.
Right.
So I got to see it from outside the curtain, and then I went to Harvard, where I got to see inside the curtain, because I actually had classes with Dr. Strugnell, who was the head researcher of the Dead Sea Scrolls before his disgraceful removal much later in life, and some of his students. And then that led me into a perfect pairing of looking at the pseudepigrapha, which is the collection of writings roughly between the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, roughly around 130 BCE to 70 CE or something like that.
Sure.
Which roughly translated to means false epitaphs. Mm-hmm. And it deals with such interesting concepts and literature, and it naturally fell in line with my growing up loving ghost stories, loving all things horror. And I'm like, okay, I think I have found my niche. And yeah, I have been here ever since, 25 something years later.
That's fantastic. I mean, just getting into a Harvard graduate program is impressive on its own. Not easy to do. So I guess let's set the stage with Second Temple Judaism. We have four primary groups that are sort of the players in this realm outside of, as far as the Jewish world is concerned. You have the Sadducees and Pharisees, and you have the Essenes doing their own thing, and then you have the Zealots, or I think some scholars refer to them as the fourth way, kind of the extremists of the time. So we have the Sadducees, politically corrupted to a large extent, a lot of dissatisfaction from the more devout people. I think the Pharisees get a bad rap in the New Testament. I don't think they were half as bad as the New Testament makes them seem to be. They're kind of the, scholarly in their own right, and certainly there were some good ones that we even hear about in the New Testament. So that's proof right there. But the Essenes are kind of almost living a monastic life out there in the desert, wanting to get away from all of the corruption of the temple. So I guess let's talk about those four groups and how they sort of come together to form the apocalyptic realm in which Christianity eventually evolves and finds itself.
Sure. So the Essenes are definitely an outlier. They may not have been the most radical, but they were very radical in and of themselves. They separated themselves from all the other groups, and and speaking of the Romans, they thoroughly believed that they were in eschatological times, who they will be fighting not just against the Romans, who in their literature they actually nicknamed the Katim, but they were going to be fighting literally with the angels of God. Mm. They even have some fantastic scrolls, like the War Scroll, the Copper Scroll, in which they lay out the logistics of what people had to do in order to keep themselves from dirtying the angels. How far away you needed to dig the latrines, those kinds of things. Wow. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. But in addition to kind of that radicalness, they also had some pretty big theological differences. The first is they believed in a solar calendar. They did not believe in a lunar calendar, which is a gigantic departure. In fact, First Enoch, in which they absolutely considered to be canonical to them, one of the four parts of that book advocate very strongly for a solar calendar, and that is the way it is to be. In fact, there's a theory that time itself, speaking of sacred geometries, that time itself is the temple. Because if you work out the math, a year in a solar calendar without precise measurements is roughly 364 days. So that equates to 90 days to a side of a temple with 4 days of trouble. And in fact, my absolute favorite snippet of a scroll is 4Q 5, 10, and 11, which starts off, I need my skill, and I, the instructor, and making a proclamation of his, i.e. God's, glorious splendor in order to instill dread and to terrify all of the spirits of the angels of destruction, the spirits of the bastards, demons, Lilith, howlers, desert dwellers, and those who suddenly strike in suddenness to lead and stray and establish spirit and to charm hearts. And you can actually trace out what each one of those entities or groups of entities are through various different channels, whether it be Psalm 91, whether it be First Enoch or Jubilees. But the interesting part is the one at the very end, where no one is safe. On these 4 days of trouble, everyone, doesn't matter how dedicated you are to God, you are in danger unless you entrusted yourself to the community. They are perhaps one of the most fanatical groups when it comes to community out of the four.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So I know that there are some that speculate, just because there's some similarities, I guess you could say, between Jesus and the Essenes, that some have speculated that he was one, that maybe that's where he was spending his time during the missing years between his finding in the temple in his early youth to, you know, the pronouncement of his baptism, beginning of his earthly ministry for 3 years. So what do you think about that, being that apocalypticism? I mean, I think he wasn't the only person that was attributed to being the Messiah. There were others at the same time that also, you know, were thought to be potentially the Messiah. Even just great teachers or great prophets. You know, so what do you think about the possibility that that's where he went? And he went to go spend time with the Essenes, which is why he would have developed perhaps such a disdain for the corruption of the temple, and that led to the cleansing of the temple, which might, as some historians think, might have been the catalyst for his crucifixion. They might have been like, that was just going one step too far, and now, you know, he's becoming too radicalized. We need to get rid of him. What are your thoughts on all that?
That, to me, falls into the category of an extraordinary claim, and I would need extraordinary proof in order to buy into that.
Sure.
Yes, there's been numerous books that tried to capitalize on this type of theory. There's even theories that John the Baptist himself was in the scene, and that's where Jesus kind of inherited it. However, you don't have to jump to the Essenes to gather the kind of apocalyptic concepts that infest early Judaism at that point. It's all over the place. Mm-hmm. So you definitely don't have to go the Essene route to arrive at that, because it had, ever since the Babylonian exile, these concepts have been flowing and proliferating through all of Judaism to the point where it was dramatically changing. In the beginning, Judaism, ancient Judaism, was a polytheistic religion. Mm-hmm. It never, the commandments, the Decalogue never stated that you shall have no other gods. It just says you shall have no other gods before me.
Right.
And yeah, it's a very common concept. I mean, even the book of Proverbs, which originally started its life out as a diplomatic set of rules of how to deal with foreign kings before it was adopted into Judaism, and then king was then translated over into God. Even it recognized that there are other deities out there. Judaism did not exist in a vacuum. It was a living, breathing part of a very rich cultural ecosystem, which had a plentitude of other deities. And it would be almost suicidal for a society to go, wait, it's only our God. I'm so sorry. You're kind of screwed in this regard. So there was definitely a recognition of this. But after the Babylonian exile, that began to change. And there are two kind of operating theories as to why that might be. Do you want me to stop there, or do you want me to keep going?
No, please go, because my next question was going to be, what do you think contributed to the change? Was it the Babylonian exile? Was there something, other development that might have occurred between First and Second Temple that would have brought about this new direction?
It's a great question. And I think there's a couple of things. So first, the first temple is destroyed. The place of power of God, the place in which held so many secrets and things that we have lost ever since then. I mean, God's full name is supposed to be 72 characters. We have no idea what that is anymore. In fact, there are, 100 hopexagomena in the Hebrew Bible, and that means words that are used only once. And while we have a really good idea of what those are, just based upon Semitic philology, we really don't quite know everything about them. And there are rituals that are referred to in, say, Deuteronomy, the act of casting sin upon Azazel, the goat. We actually don't understand that whatsoever. Is Azazel the name of the goat? Is it the name of a demon? No one really knows. We've just kind of cobbled together a really good kind of translation based upon the Masoretics and, now the Dead Sea Scrolls, so we can compare multiple different copies to each other. But anyway, a great deal was lost during this time. So you have the people that were cast forth from their nation into exile, and the two kind of operating theories as to why you had this change into a much more bleak, dire, and moreover dualistic religion is there's this concept in Judaism that each of the 72 nations is led by an angel. If all of these other nations are in turn beating up on Israel, that must mean that there were bad angels, right?
Right, yeah.
And then that could have led to that. That's a possibility. I'm not denying it, but a much more compelling argument, and I think one that is almost as widely accepted as almost anything else now, is that Judaism came into contact with Zoroastrianism, which was hugely prevalent in the Babylonian Empire. And it had perhaps the most advanced dualistic concept that has ever existed up until that point. You have not only a supreme being, Ahura Mazda, but you also have a true enemy of God, Ahriman. And Ahriman hated God. He hated his creations with all of his might. And there's even some fantastic parables. I started off one of my episodes by reading this snippet from one of the texts, in which I said, okay, if you didn't know what religion this was from, what would you say it is? Because it's essentially Ahriman standing in the darkness and snarling to God that I hate you, I hate your creations, and I would turn your creations against you. That
so this
sounds
is
suspiciously like Christianity.
So this is where we start to see the metamorphosis of the Satan into the devil, I think,
Yes.
because you got in the Old Testament clearly more. Satan is not even really a proper name. It's really a role you take on, right? We have a lot of discussion about that, on this show and in this church. But once you get to the New Testament, now something fundamentally has changed. Now the devil becomes almost a true competitor, not quite to the degree of Zoroastrianism, where it's almost an equal. Well, it is an equal force. The devil's always, he must submit to God in the theology of the Christian church, but we're still being seduced into thinking that he still has more power than any of us. And so you have Christians today that are truly afraid of the devil. And this is not at all characteristic of anything you see in the Old Testament. You know, in Job, he's acting more like part of the court. He's like a courtier of God, you know, and he's there to kind of serve the purpose of the throne. And his role is the unfortunate role of having to sort of test people's faith and all that. There's really no indication that the serpent in the Garden of Eden is the devil. We've made that leap later on, you know.
Exactly.
So yeah, that's a fascinating thing. So Zoroastrianism influences Judaism. Do you think Sethian Gnosticism might have influenced Zoroastrianism?
No, Zoroastrianism is much more ancient.
More ancient.
In fact, it has the oldest. I mean, this is something that most people don't realize. Zoroastrianism has the oldest religious text in the world, bar none.
And it was consistent. Is it consistent with how it developed? Like it still had that dualism from the very beginning?
No, it was only after. So Zoroastrianism erupted from the Proto-Iranian people around 19th century BCE. And out of that group, you had a split. You had the Hindus, and then you had the Zoroastrians. And the funny thing is that today, the biggest concentration of Zoroastrianism is in India, even though there are religious centers spread in Los Angeles, Chicago, in the Northeast, a few other places. Mm-hmm. But most of it is in India. Zoroastrianism is rather limited in that you can only be born into that religion. You cannot convert into it. In fact,
wow.
if a person's mother married an outsider, then the son or daughter is only partially accepted by the community. It's extremely rigid in what it does. But that text, you see it kind of change from this prosaic concepts until you get Zarathustra, who comes along, who is a revolutionary figure within the religion. And you get to see more of this dualism kind of spring to life at that time. I am not an expert in Zoroastrianism. I know more than my fair share, but I can't really trace all of the threads around it. And I'm not going to pretend like I have subject matter expertise in that.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's amazing the level of dualism that you get starting in Zarathustra's time and then progressing onward. The sad thing is that with Zoroastrianism, during the time of Julius Caesar hated Zoroastrian priests, absolutely loathed them. And wherever he happened to be, he made it a major part of his campaign to put to the torch any Zoroastrian priests and books during that time. And after his death, you will see a massive depletion of knowledge of Zoroastrianism to the point where nowadays vast swaths of that text, of the religious ceremonies, the meanings are lost because we just don't know them anymore. It's fascinating, but I think I've gotten off topic. I apologize.
No, I think it's fascinating because I mean, really, what I really wanted to get out of this show tonight is really the foundations for people. I mean, we have a large Christian audience, clearly, and so not exclusively Christian, but people that think they know something about the Christian faith, and really, it's always within the context to what they've been taught as far as contemporary knowledge goes. When you really sort of dig into the origins of some of these belief systems that people, Christians in particular, take for granted, they're kind of shocked when they hear about, well, it's not quite as you thought. It's not quite as what you've been taught or what you think is true about the theology. And so we're always sort of relearning, and try to re-educate and sort of unlearning some of this stuff too, so that they can, get a good foundation. So no, this is actually exactly where I wanted to go with it, because it's fascinating, and it makes such perfect sense. What you say is that you have this major dualistic influence right there, accessible to them, and that would have had made or produced a fundamental change within their culture and their religious identity spiritually, and shaped who they became, leading to this more apocalyptic, I guess, mindset that we find ourselves in that first century.
Oh, but going back to what you were saying earlier, yes, in Job, there's never a mention of the word Satan in Job. That is a horrible mistranslation. Mm-hmm. The term is Hasatan.
Yes.
The chief prosecutor. It is a technical legal term in biblical Judaism, and it is a chief prosecutor who is arguing a particular case. In fact, the entire story of Job is a much more ancient one than the Hebrew Bible. It had existed throughout Mesopotamia until it was adopted into Judaism, transformed, and then sometime around Second Temple Judaism, it got the Hollywood ending where Job sees God as a fiery tornado, and suddenly he's given a brand new family, etc. It doesn't make things right. His old family is still dead. He just gets a new one, but it is this kind of Hollywood ending that people kind of expected, and plus it helped to differentiate itself from the older legends that had been circulating around. So,
do you think it's some of it is human nature wanting to find a genuine scapegoat to kind of blame someone else for their misdeeds? Because in Genesis, you have the serpent, and my understanding of Judaism, or Judaism's interpretation of that, is that's Yetzer Hara. That's the proclivity of mankind to do the wrong thing, to be selfish and to make bad choices out of self-interest, which then leads to these moments throughout the Old Testament where you have the adversary, right? And even the angel of God is sometimes referred to as Hasatan, as you were mentioning there, where it standing as an adversary or an opposition to an action that someone is going to take. It is only when we get to essentially Jesus's temptation in the desert that we start to see the familiar devil take form or start to take shape. Not completely, certainly not to the degree that the Middle Ages, had its way with it. But how do that evolution of the devil? I mean, and you coming from strong interest in demonology, how would you say that comes full circle? Yetzer Hara to Hasatan to Satan being a proper noun to now the devil as Christians would know it and become fearful of it as some kind of entity that's out to take their soul.
Yeah, it is a really fascinating thing. And in fact, you see parallels in that kind of evolution. Take Lilith, for example. Lilith started off as one of three Akkadian goddesses of the wind. Lili, Lilith, and Ardulilu, I think their names were. Mm-hmm. But anyway, and then one of them, Ardot-Lilu, she was an embodiment of not just wind, but also perverse sexual desire. And then she is adopted as a regional thing, not just into Judaism, as kind of this fictional night hag who inhabits ruins. And that's kind of all she is. I mean, even in Isaiah, you see her mentioned residing in Dudael, which is the place where all of the bad things just happen to live. And then later on, she is adopted as the first wife of Adam, because Genesis has two separate creation stories in it.
Right.
And she becomes this full-fledged demon all on her own. and tracing that path of goddess to night hag to demon is fascinating. And you see something really similar within Satan himself. It starts off as this, where there must be a enemy to God. And so you have this period after being influenced by Zoroastrianism where they didn't know who this enemy was. There's no literature that indicates that. In fact, there is no mention of the word demon in the Hebrew Bible. I mean, that shocks people. They're like, what? There has to be. No, there's only 1,000 individual vocabulary words in the Hebrew Bible. It's not that difficult to go through and trace them all out. Yeah. The only one that
Orthodox Jews reject the idea of demons. Orthodox Jews today, they reject. They don't believe that at all.
The only one that comes closest is the word Sha'ir, which is kind of like a goat entity, maybe a goat demon, like a Pan or something similar, but that's kind of the closest you got. However, you do find references to these types of entities in older Psalms, such as Psalm 91. You'll find, the arrow that flieth by day is actually a reference to Lilith herself. Mm-hmm. The destruction that walks in, whatever. You get all of these various different allusions, and that is a Second Temple Psalm that was written much later than all the other ones. But regardless, there is this floundering period where people have no idea who this enemy is. And there are so many candidates that were put forth to fill this void. And you find them all over the place, especially in the pseudepigrapha, where, the pseudepigrapha, if you think about it, it's a collection of texts that were attempting to explain in a false authoritarian way away all of these troubling aspects to scripture that people really couldn't explain. Genesis 6 is a perfect example. The B'nai Elohim, the sons of God, descend down. That is a really troubling passage. And Judaism has been wrestling for that for centuries. And then you had two separate authoritative, quote unquote, explanations come forth in First Enoch and Jubilees that attempts to put all of this to rest and to explain it theologically. Well, the devil's the same way. One of the earliest candidates that were put forth out there was Baal-zebub, literally Lord of the Flies. Baal meaning Lord, Zebub is flies, plural. Zebub is fly, singular. And Baal-zebub actually was a god of healing and who had a sacred animal, which was the fly, strangely enough, who was then associated with death due to flies. And finally became, hey, this, flies can't be a good thing. They are harbingers of death and carrion. Maybe that is our candidate. And so you will have pseudepigraphal books that reference Baal-zebub as the enemy of God. And then you had numerous others. You had Beliar, Belial, and the list just keeps going on and on and on. And it's not until much later do you see a much more firm concept that, it's Satan. It has to be Satan, right? That's its name. Yeah. And then the name Lucifer came up, and it just kind of snowballed from there. So yes, there was a time in which the devil was identified, but there was at least 150 years where people were just throwing names at the wall and seeing what would stick, honestly.
Which is very typical, I think, of how archetypes develop, and this is where I get back to and I teach demonology to people. In fact, let me give you a really poignant example. I was asked recently by a top network, by a top show, I won't mention the show, to potentially come on and talk about exorcism and demonology, and give insight into it. And so the primary contact, the researcher for the show, called me. We had a long, almost 2-hour discussion. And needless to say, I wasn't called back, because what he wanted someone to come on and talk about monsters hiding under your bed or in your closet, and that's there to steal your soul. And, I started talking about Jungian psychology and how archetypes evolve and develop, and that we give names to things and we create these concepts that become real. And if we put enough energy into creating them, even subconsciously, then they become real sentient forces that must be contended with. The brain is just that powerful. It's just that sophisticated. And that accounts for the majority of what we see in the work. So it's, not quite like the Hollywood movie. It's not like the Exorcist movie. These are not monsters, other than the fact that they're the monsters that live within. But I've never seen an evil outside of human nature that is worse than human nature itself. So, as I people are like, aren't you afraid of demons? Aren't you afraid to go into these houses or work with possessed people? It's like, no, I'm actually more concerned about, the people I'm going to run into at McDonald's than I, I mean, honestly, because, human nature is, we don't need demons. They're evil. The evil is all there. Everything you'd ever want is right there. So, how do you think, looking at it from an archetypal perspective, do you think that's exactly what's going on here? Do you think that, the loss of the first temple, which subsequently resulted, at least presumably, maybe you have some insight into this as well, I'd like to know, the loss of the Ark of the Covenant. So the physical presence of God, the Shekinah, all of that is lost in the raid. And then, they go into the Babylonian exile, and then they come out a different people, right? And then, and of course, because of the Roman occupation, there's always going to be players on both sides, and now you have Jewish people who are sort of selling themselves for a good life, and then you end up with this aristocratic kind of temple that now we have in the second. But no. I mean, we still have the Holy of Holies, but it's kind of empty in there. So right. It almost is like an archetypal symbol of the loss of the Jewish heart and soul. And that might have had maybe some kind of psychological effect on them that led to them seeking or searching for answers elsewhere. What are your thoughts on all that?
That is a really interesting observation. I would say that typically, as one's worldview is expanded from thinking very simply to, say, a person goes out into the world, comes into contact with foreign ideas, foreign concepts, and then begins to have a more robust view of how things are or how things may operate. Something could be similar to that within the Second Temple mindset. You also had this idea that everything is not absolutely unshakable. Before, God was the root of everything. There was a major destruction. That was God who did that. Mm-hmm. God was not someone who's just going to love and care for you no matter what. In fact, even the idea of Sheol, an afterlife, it wasn't some great place to be. It was right. A dank, dark cave underground where you weren't tortured, but you weren't exactly happy there. It was just kind of a gray existence. And a lot of that kind of translated over into Second Temple, where suddenly maybe God isn't the root of everything. Maybe he's no longer the source of the lying spirit that would go forth and talk to prophets anymore. Perhaps it really is something much more nefarious in nature that we are dealing with. And by gaining an enemy, God coincidentally seemed to become weaker. Because that's one of the fundamental weaknesses within theology itself. if God is all powerful, then why does he have a contender to begin with? And there has been so much, convoluted, wheels upon wheels of trying to justify all of this. It's funny to see movies try to tackle this theory and get it completely wrong, except for maybe one or two. But yeah, it really is. I mean, I think that Judaism, it lost something with that first temple. It never really got it all back.
Yeah.
And yes, it may have gotten an enemy at the end of the day, but I don't think it was richer for that.
And then it kind of continues on, because now you have that holy site occupied by a completely different religion, dare I say, almost hostile religion to them.
Exactly.
And what do? I mean, you end the world if you try to take it back. I mean, that's World War III right there. If they ever try to build the third temple, knock down that mosque, it would be truly, there would be serious consequences to that. So now they still live in that.
There hasn't been a solid red heifer born within the boundaries of Israel since the Second Temple was destroyed. So we're safe for the moment.
Safe for the time being.
There's no real will. There's probably like three people in the world that want to do that.
There is the Temple Institute, I think it's called. That's great. I mean, they've rebuilt all of the sacred vessels, and a
lot of that is misguided evangelical Christianity too.
Well, I guess you could say that. Yeah.
They don't understand the mass. Basically. So it's. I mean, the other thing you've given us an insight into, JJ, is another thing that annoys evangelical Christians. And I don't want to sound like I'm picking on them, because
That's
anyway.
okay. You can pick up.
We know you're picking
You can pick up.
Well, I know. I do love them, but it's actually the redactive process of how the scriptures come to us. That of course there's a development from other pertaining myths or archetypes from around the region. But then the fact, so you mentioned about Job and how the ending of Job happens and all of that. Redaction theory is something that people I would call bibliologists don't like at all. But for me, it's what makes the scriptures so authentic, because or rather, if we say that the scriptures are God-breathed, for example, which I'm quite happy with that terminology. I know it's a bit cliche, but I'm happy with that terminology. Yeah, God-breathed, but actually put into material form by men. And this is the process that brings that about. And for me, that doesn't make it less authoritative. It actually makes it more. And so I'm not surprised that these ideas get skewed so much in culture, because there are people fundamentally hostile to them. And so it's not saying that, God makes a mistake and therefore man's got to correct it through some redactive process. It's more that God has acted and man is trying to understand that action. And it's only in points of crisis where you reevaluate those things. Like in life, when we have crises in life, i.e., when we become an adolescent, when we become an adult, when we get married, when we have babies, it's those points where, funnily enough, the sacraments tend to come, right? The points of movement between one form and another, and the same happens within the scriptures. The same happens within the revelation of God's people. So they're exiled under the Babylonians, and there's a total reevaluation of what it means to be a Christian. A Jew. And the same is happening in Jesus' time. That's what Pharisees are doing. They're trying to figure out how to be authentically the Israelites under Roman occupation and all of that. Anyway.
Exactly. No, I completely agree. And that's actually something I did want to say, that studying Semitic philology, studying the mythology that arose within the Middle East, it can seem like a lot to be able to digest. Because if you, like, for example, I grew up Southern Baptist and then in college converted to Catholicism for numerous reasons we don't need to get into. But regardless, if you accept the idea that, the Bible is the word of God, and then you don't bother to look into it, then if you actually start studying that, then you will see a lot of fragmentation around that concept. If you start comparing the Septuaginta, the Greek version of the Bible, to the Masoretic text, then you will find tons of omissions, because these are people that in the end of the day was copying this stuff over and over and over. And let's be honest, that's a very boring job. No matter how fervent you happen to be, if you were doing this 8 hours a day, you're going to make a mistake. And yes, they had the Masoretics had a ton of very complicated rules in place to make sure that everything was just perfect, but mistakes still slip through, and they're always going to slip through. But that's never a reason to disbelieve. Like for me, growing up as a Southern Baptist, I was taught, oh yeah, anyone can just pick up the Bible and read it and you're going to instantly understand it. No. There is no worse.
Very dangerous to do that
in the world. You can understand a first blush. It's very much like kissing through a veil. You'll get the feel of the lips, but you're not going to understand everything that's happening behind the scenes.
That's well said, JJ. We're going to take our next break here. We'll be back after this. Don't go away. Welcome back, everyone, to the third and final part of Vestiges After Dark. It's been a fantastic and fascinating discussion so far on Second Temple Judaism and how it influenced the early Christian world, as well as the entire ancient world, you could say, how all these different philosophies were coming out of that area, all competing for viability, you might say. When we come back here, we're going to be taking your questions. We hope that you have some. You can ask them in the chat, or you can call into the show. Your choice, but we always prefer you call in. The number to call is 718-362-6380. That's 718-362-6380. Remember to enter PIN number 855-4111 to get placed into the queue. That's 855-4111. I'll have that number up on the screen for those of you on YouTube. Don't go away. When you really look at that time period, you see every potential philosophy that we now take for granted today finding its origin in a lot of what was going on in that region at that time. And it's really quite fascinating. The sharing of ideas. I had mentioned Sethian Gnosticism earlier. I was wondering if it had any impact or influence to Zoroastrianism. Perhaps it was the other way around, actually, because everyone was really trying to figure out the problem of evil. I mean, ultimately, that's what it's really all about, right? And then you have these different religions kind of come out of the answer to that problem, and then there's like a solution, and that if you follow this, then you get there. It's kind of interesting. I'm a firm believer that the Ebionites really were the precursor to the Muslims. I really think Islam was influenced by perhaps a divergent sect that went off into that part of Arabia and then sort of blossomed into what we now know as Islam. It's interesting just to watch the evolution, you might say, even right down so across the world. We had JJ, you had mentioned about Sheol, and I've always found it fascinating, and we can kind of use this as a bit of a foreshadowing for your next appearance on the show, how much it parallels Japanese Yomi. That is it a realization? I mean, are people having a metaphysical realization, and that even though we have all these different religions that sort of try to describe it all these different ways, and at the surface it looks, superficially to be very different, but fundamentally they're really not all that different, and people are still coming to the same conclusions ultimately, at least in terms of that internal realization. They're just using different language or different archetypes to explain it. I mean, what do you think? Or do you think Yomi is a very different thing than Sheol?
I think it's very different. I have never been a fan. And in fact, I think I'm kind of the most ardent enemy of the idea of a universalism that was promoted by Joseph Campbell, and he kind of stole from other people. Mm-hmm. Just the idea of it, I've never found any evidence for it. And to me, those kind of like bombastic theories of, it sounds similar, so therefore it has to be true. I think there are certain human experiences that can ring true in very similar ways, no matter what cultural perspective you happen to be coming from. And that may be the explanation for it. I don't know. I certainly can't say I have all the answers, because the more I study, the more I realize I know nothing. But
right. It's the way it goes.
Absolutely.
I mean, at least you have the humility to admit it. See, there's too many scholars out there that don't have the humility to admit that. So, you're already doing the right thing by being able to say that knowledge only shows you just how ignorant you are.
Fortunately, I studied under some amazing professors and people that I wish I had a quarter of their brain to be able to do anything with. Yeah. So yeah, they kind of whether it was through osmosis or what, but I had that hammered into me at a very young age. Thank goodness.
That's fantastic. It's great. So Brandon, Jamie, do we have questions for our guests from the chat so far?
I've got one from Not Sure. He's asking, what is the significance of the Black Madonna?
The significance of the Black Madonna.
That is correct.
Do you have any insights in that on JJ?
I do not know.
I don't know too much about it. I mean, I know Father Chris, do you know too much? Do you know anything about that? That's
it kind of depends what he means by that. I mean, there's lots of Black Madonnas in terms of images of the Blessed Virgin Mary.
I think there's some that is he referring to Church is he referring to the one that's sort of related to Mary Magdalene and all that? Is that what he's getting?
Not sure. Can you clarify in the chat?
Yeah, because I mean, I know there's, as Father Chris said, there is variation on that, but I'm not sure that I know too much about it.
I'm pretty much zero on it.
Yeah.
Maybe mentioned in a History Channel documentary somewhere, but that's about it.
Father,
that's that humility kicking in again. We don't know everything.
Yeah, I mean, well, there's just no way. I mean, when you talk about, I mean, it's like someone was asking, they wanted me to do sacred geometry. It's like, I don't know anything about sacred geometry. I mean, if you can find a good guess for it, that would be great. But I'm not the one to teach it. So let's talk about, well, we get the clarification here. I would be curious to know, JJ, what are your thoughts on the role of the Sanhedrin in the Second Temple period? Like how much power did they really exert? I mean, was it really tempered under, obviously Roman authority? Was it very political? Did it have any redeeming spiritual characteristics? That sort of thing. Oh, we lost his microphone. Okay. Yep, you're back.
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, sorry, I don't know the answer to that one. I never really. So if it comes after 70 CE or even comes close to that, then that is where my knowledge kind of tapers off in a pretty dramatic cliff. The ironic part is, the more you study, the more narrowed your focus becomes to where you're kind of, an expert in one thing and one thing only. And for me, that became kind of Second Temple Judaism through the lens of the pseudepigrapha and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Otherwise, I am not quite so familiar with the political escapades that was going on at that point in time.
I see. Okay. I mean, that's fair enough. I mean, honestly, it would be very complex to try to even compact all of that knowledge into one field of study because there's so many different things that sort of go on.
Well, mainly just in the fact of the sheer amount of languages that you have to study. I was up to 14 by the time I finished my graduate program, and I specialized in a rare one called Classical Ethiopic, which I still love to death and hope to actually teach a class on at some point.
No, that's yeah. I mean, you're right. I mean, there's just a sheer volume of language and interpretation and how that becomes influential in how people understand things today. How about Hellenism? How about how I guess Hellenistic philosophy might have influenced the Second Temple period, because that would have been the other side of the equation. If you had Zoroastrianism influencing from the standpoint of that dualistic mentality, Greek philosophy certainly made its way in, and I guess that's where we get to some of the Gnostic ideas. But do you think do you think Greek thought and Greek philosophy had impact on the the Second Temple Jew, or not at all?
I would say not quite as much as one might think. I mean, those ideas were certainly present, but you don't really find a lot of this. You find the concepts of logic, which really kind of took over much later in Christian thought than you did at the very beginning. In fact, Judaism has such a rich magical tradition. Early Christianity, which is really just Judaism under a different name, had such a rich magical tradition, and you still find that preserved in certain orthodoxies, whether it be Coptic Orthodox or especially Ethiopian Orthodox, in which they really kind of view Christ as not just the Messiah, but also the greatest magician that ever lived. Mm-hmm. And there's a huge departure from this concept of logic being the base to actually magic and mystery being the base. And I think that's one of the reasons why ever since finding out about them, I have fallen in love with the Ethiopic Orthodox Church and have studied a great deal about them, especially since they're probably the only organized religion that still believes that the pseudepigrapha is a collection of holy writings. In fact, they have the largest canon of any Christian faith that there is.
Because they include all that. Yeah. Well, they also think they have the Ark of the Covenant.
Yeah, Axum.
They do in the Mother Church.
Yeah.
Yep.
What do you think about all that? Every year, every so many years or so, the priest says he's going to let someone in to see it, but it never really kind of materializes. Do you think it's just one of the numerous Ark replicas that every Ethiopian church has, or do you think there is something to the claim?
It's a really good question. I honestly wish I knew. I do know that the Mother Church in Addis Ababa, they are much more strict of any other place in the world. I mean, there is one priest who has been guarding this thing, and that is a very tried and true, passed down position ever since.
Yeah, he doesn't leave.
Speaking of, and one other interesting thing about the Ethiopic Orthodox Church is that they have a class of priests called Debtera, and they thoroughly believe that they can take demonic power and fuel that and use that as fuel to harness God's work. And you'll see them have these very intricate slaughtering sessions of goats in which they lure in demons using sacrifices of wine and eggs, and then they will sacrifice the goat, create a parchment out of it, and then draw mystical symbols, which are usually the eyes of Solomon plus iconography, along with Zoroastrian magical text, which consists of red and black writing, to then capture the demonic spirit. And that's what people will then wear around their neck, scrolls, prayer scrolls. I've actually have translated quite a few of them, served as someone on someone's doctorate dissertation who was studying them from an artistic perspective, got to look at them at Howard University. They're a huge collection of them. They're fascinating, they're beautiful, and they're amazing. But
yeah, I mean, it's a mystery where it is, although I know that there are some Orthodox Jews that that state they know exactly where the Ark of the Covenant is. I don't know if it's true or not, because I mean, it hasn't been, proven in any tangible or objective sense, but there's a lot of people making claims that, it's out there somewhere. Some have even speculated that it's underneath the Dome of the Rock, somewhere in some cavern under there that we can't access because of the restrictions and political restrictions. So it's fascinating to think, but I wonder what would happen if it ever did surface in some way. I mean, was this some kind of ancient technology, or was there something truly mystical about it? Is the question I have. Was it like a battery or something that made it so powerful, or did it really contain the presence of God in a truly tangible way that it could do the things that the scripture reports that it could do? Or is it all legend? I mean, that's these are just fascinating questions that I've always had on my mind. There's no way to answer them, of course, until somebody finds it. But
absolutely, I will tell you this though: if it ever was found, and just gazing upon the box itself, it would radically transform our concept of that box, and especially of how angels looked in the ancient times.
Yes.
Because we have this idea of, Indiana Jones, where it's just, two female figures with their wings pointed to each other. That is not the case. These are guardian beasts straight out of Akkadian myth, in which, they have 4 legs and they have a human head, and those are the cherubim. Mm-hmm. And Mike, don't even get me started on the seraphim, which are based upon Phoenician depictions. They're probably fire snakes. But
they're terrifying. I mean,
all of them were.
Yeah. I mean,
it's a dragon archetype, right?
Yeah.
It actually kind of, because everywhere that you see the word saraf in the Hebrew Bible, it refers to either burning ones or more specifically burning snakes. And it's only within the concept of the seraphim that, people get this humanoid idea that comes out of that. But there's no textual evidence that you find of that within Isaiah itself. It's just six wings for each. So
talking about the, spiritual creatures made me think about just the afterlife in general. And we were kind of going back and forth on Sheol, being that there wasn't really a pleasant afterlife. Your life was your sacred moment. And then you kind of went into this state of, I guess, increasing unconsciousness. It was kind of like this sort of sleep, this half awake, half sleep kind of existence for all eternity. Which makes Christianity kind of amazing in the harrowing of hell when Jesus goes in and brings all of the righteous out of that condition and brings them back to life. And remember, Christians think of heaven as like this spiritual dimension, but it was absolutely in every way, in every sense that Jesus reports it to be a truly physical experience, which is why the resurrection it's so important that we understand it's a physical thing. It wasn't like some kind of spiritual awakening. It really happens in the actual physical body that rises from the dead. It's what makes it important with doubting Thomas touching the nail marks in his hands and all of that. But it also makes me think about how the Judaism's concept of an afterlife has evolved dramatically, because I know a lot of Jewish people that don't see Sheol as the afterlife at all anymore. It's more like a traditional, almost, dare I say, Christian kind of concept of heaven. It's a happy place, a paradise. You go to be with God. There's no pain. There's no suffering. How did that leap happen? Was it Christianity that influenced it? Was it more of that Zoroastrian influence, or was it more of that searching for identity? Where was that turning point? Do you know?
I think that is once again Zoroastrianism coming into play, because you find there's no idea of heaven and hell baked into things. There was this idea that hell was somewhere below, and then heaven was somewhere above. But then you get a lot of books that start playing with that idea and trying to cement it. In one of the books of Enoch, you'll actually find heaven and hell right next to each other, separated by a very thin line. And the parable being that you have to walk the straight and narrow in order to make sure that you stay on heaven's side and not on hell's side. Right. But yeah, it's, and the thing is that in Zoroastrianism, it actually suffered from a major theological crisis, because you had this realm of darkness in which Ahriman lived in. You have this realm of light that is ruled by Ahura Mazda, and there is going to be an astrological war at the end of days, in which all of the bad people will be thrown into hell, all the good people will be taken into the realm of light, and then Ahura Mazda will then seal up the realm of evil with a portion of himself. And that was always kind of the question of, well, doesn't that make Ahura Mazda less than what he was in the beginning?
Yeah.
And yeah, I still think you find some of these ideals boiling over and infesting early Christianity. But one last thing I was going to say is that you also have, and besides just Gnosticism within early Christianity, you also had a whole nother religion of Mandaism. And that kind of combined a lot of highlights of Gnostic thought with Zoroastrianism, with Hellenic, especially a lot of Hellenic imagery, iconography, and ideals. And you get this whole weird beast of a religion that most people don't, know a whole lot about anymore. But it was hugely influential in the time period. And the language is Mandaic is a fascinating language, but
there's still some pockets of it out there. Is it in Iraq?
Yes.
Yeah. There's still like a few pockets of it.
There is. Yeah. And there's actually you find some imagery that from Mandaism that was brought over into Christianity, such as a cross with a very vibrant red banner that's attached to it. That came straight from Mandaism.
Yes.
Is it not also present in the Druze?
Yes.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And Druze, that's another religion that will never accept any converts, and as a result, it's being slowly strangled out as well.
Interesting.
They have a saying in Iraq, amongst Muslims in Iraq, they say, eat, sleep with the Christians, but eat with the Druze. So you can trust the Druze to give you food that you can eat, and you can trust the Christians not to kill you in your sleep.
I guess there is some truth to that. I guess it's not completely wrong, right? What's our next question there, Jamie?
Okay, so not sure has another question. He says JJ did a podcast about a year ago. I believe it was called He Who Sees Shadow People. And not sure, would like to know if he has any new insight on that or any thoughts on it.
All right, shadow people, JJ.
Yeah, so that was, I had brought on Will, who is an active member of our Discord, and it's a good friend. And he is a part of a paranormal group, and was going over some of the experiences that he has had. And yeah, he actually saw a lot of shadow people, a lot of other things. I don't pretend to know what shadow people are. I've never bothered to put up a hypothesis. I have never encountered one myself. This is why I am more of an academic scholar. Scholar's probably stretching it, but I'm more of an academic person. I'm good at textual things. However, I do believe very strongly in spiritual warfare. And one of the major emphasis that the podcast goes over is both insights from Second Temple Judaism, throwing in some Japanese stuff, and then at the end of the day, also looking at protection mechanisms and spiritual warfare, and especially coming up with like the differences between demonic obsession, possession, oppression, etc. So yeah, and this is why I rely upon paranormal investigators who know a whole lot more about the active practical side of things than I ever would to come on and do interviews. So, and it's been a great experience being able to get a lot more kind of practical experience through their eyes.
Well, I can say from a person that has worked some of the field side of it, less so, I guess you could say, in the realm of theory, just because of the nature of my work, our work. What I have found is that shadow people is not a thing as much as it's a type of apparition that can be any sorts of many different kinds of things. That's what I've experienced. So I don't think it's particularly dark, although it can be. I don't think it's it can be it could be something as simple as a ghost trying to manifest itself, but not having the energy to do so in any kind of brilliant way. And so what you get is this void, because it is sort of a antithesis of life, what a ghost is, I guess, intrinsically, which of course, my definition is going to vary greatly from the standard paranormal worldview. I have my own metaphysics that I work with on that. But what I have found is that shadow people are just kind of like, it could be anything. It's just it seems to be a low energy frequency at the very least. And I guess that's where it gets labeled as being demonic.
Dark, yeah.
But, in the times in my work where I have seen demons with my actual human eyes, not in my mind's eye, not in a psychic medium way, but physically seen them, shadow people would not describe what I've seen. Not at all. It's a very, very different thing from that. So what I have experienced, I would say is a type of low energy apparition, which could be a manifestation of any number of things. Which I guess you could say ghosts and Judaism is a thing. You got Dybbuk's, right? So what do you know anything about Dybbuk's, JJ, or how that kind of plays into the idea of a wrathful or evil spirit in the Jewish worldview today?
Yeah, Dybbuk's are really fascinating, and so are jinn. And I actually kind of believe they are opposite sides to the same kind of coin.
Interesting.
Dybbuk's are not demons, but yet they can range from, they're rarely ever good, but they most certainly are very self-interested, and they can range into the evil. And I have actually interviewed people that have had accounts of being possessed by a Dybbuk, and did some pretty horrible things while that was going on. So I don't pretend to know everything about them, but I will say that I hope to never encounter one. I will put it that way.
That's wise. That's wise.
Jinn are highly misunderstood as well. They can actually range from being very beneficial to very evil to everything in between.
Absolutely.
So, well, the genie in a lamp, right? I mean, the idea of the being granted 3 wishes. It's definitely not the Aladdin story when you deal with them, but I've certainly encountered people that have worked in conjuring an interaction with one to gain a benefit in much the same way that one might, in a fictitious story, rub a lamp and ask, for a wish to be granted. So there's a similarity there. Of course, this is conjuration being done with sigils and whatnot. But it happens, and they're not necessarily evil. We had a case, JJ, that you might have found interesting. Unfortunately, the client's no longer alive, but we had a case with years ago here in the Atlanta area where he grew up as a child, kind of a grade school age child in Saudi Arabia. And he was playing, as I recall, on his property, and then went missing, and was missing for 3 days, and then came back, was found, just, I think, wandering the streets, and was brought back home, but he was never the same.
Yeah, that's the story.
Yeah.
From the mother.
Yeah, this is from the mom. This was on a back investigation before we even met him. This is what we were told. And when we asked him about that period of 3 days, the only thing he said was he wandered because he heard a voice call him into the desert. And he wandered because in Saudi Arabia, the desert's everywhere. So he wandered out into the wilderness, and as he was walking, he saw this large, dark shadow, not a shadow person, but a large, massive shadow come up out of, 3-dimensionally, come up out of the sand, and it enveloped him. And then he was in darkness. And the next thing he remembered was being brought back home 3 days later. But over that period of time, his behavior changed, and he was never the same after that. So by the time we met him as an adult, years later, he was exhibiting all of the signs of full-blown possession, but it wasn't anything like demonic possession. It was truly a very cunning, seductive, intelligent sentience that had invaded or overlapped his own.
It was a very arrogant presence, too.
Very much so. And the rights of the church had no bearing on this thing because it didn't see any, it didn't have any conflict with it. that was the funny thing about it, is that it didn't have any problem with God. Its position was that this body's mine now, and I'm not leaving it, and there's nothing you can do to get me out of it. It was that kind of attitude. And so we realized after performing a minor exorcism, and which would bring him to a state of stability, but not to a state of being liberated. We could never liberate him with that. And we were planning to do a solemn exorcism down the road, but we decided to go a different route and to try to extract this thing using ceremonial magic. So we created a demon trap for him using a triangle of art that is portable and we can take around with us. We tested it out in a few other cases and it was very successful. So we thought we had a good step here. Then he got himself incarcerated before we could come back and attempt this. Ended up spending a couple years in jail and then died.
Yeah, this jinn basically overtook his behavior, and he was having very bizarre behavior, was using hallucinogenic drugs, which was not in his character according to Mom. And every time we would try to plan on meeting up with him, he'd end up getting locked up. And
wow.
He was locked up for a while and then ended up going into a mental health facility where he literally dropped dead one day. And this guy was in his early 20s.
And it was like a heart attack, right?
It was like a heart attack.
I mean, something that should not have happened.
He literally was walking on the sidewalk and dropped dead of a heart attack.
And that's what it said. That was the interesting thing, is that this entity said that that's what would happen. He said that that this body is to do. He has been granted permission to do with it what he pleases, and that when he's done having his fun, he's going to take it. It was a very, like I said, very arrogant, but not hostile. There was none of the usual effects that we see. Like when we do exorcisms, there's a lot of growling and screaming. This was just it was like talking to a real, like a stand-up comedian, pain in the ass kind of personality.
Right. Very arrogant, very dismissive of us, and me especially. Told us at one point, you shouldn't even be here. There was one response on the Ovulus where it was directed towards me because I was the only one that heard it. And yeah, just very, very dismissive, very arrogant.
Yeah.
And it was a case that really bothered me for quite a while.
Well, it bothers any case that goes unresolved bothers you. So, sometimes, most of the time we can go in there and after, a few interactions with the client, we can get them back on track. Most of what we see is spiritual apathy and whatnot. But this particular time, every now and then you get a case where it's complicated when the law gets involved and now you don't have access to the client anymore. Then your hands get tied. There's nothing you can do. And I think that was by design. I really do.
I mean, that's what happened, or we would have kept on it. And, we may have been successful with the demon trap.
I think we would have.
Every time we had tried to organize getting together, he would get in trouble.
Yep.
So
every single time.
Right.
So that was our one and only interaction with what we believe to be a genuine jinn. It had all of the characteristics that you'd see and none of the typical behavior of what you would see as a fallen angel or in the classic Judeo-Christian sense. So it was fascinating. And yes, very different than, a demon in every sense of the term.
That is an amazing and very frightening tale. Dear goodness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It was. It was not. I mean, he had a credible musical ability.
Oh,
remember?
He was sweet and endearing when it was him.
When it was him.
And he played the guitar for us and was just very charming, very full of life when he wasn't under the influence. And, when the mom called me after almost a year of not having contact and she told me he had died, it was pretty crushing.
Yeah, it was. It's always a shame, when you can't be all things to all people.
Right. You can't help everybody.
And you try, but your hands are tied by certain things in life, and that's just one of them. So, and a lot of times you don't get a lot of cooperation from clients. Most of the time it's families desperate for help, but the clients and the victim themselves doesn't really want to participate in any of it. And those are the hardest cases, because you can't force the grace of God down people's throats. No. You just have to kind of be an instrument to kind of inspire them to come to some type of relationship. But so many times people are so far gone already. They're so apathetic to it from the get-go. It's really hard to come in there as a priest or an exorcist and say, God loves you. It's at that point, they're beyond caring. So it's tough. It is. That's the worst part. But yeah, I've never dealt with anything that was as tricky as that jinn. I mean, that was certainly one of the most unusual circumstances we've ever encountered, but gives us, I guess, some insight, JJ, into the complexity of what's out there, because I think the average Christian today, even Catholics to a large extent, have this idea that there's only angels and demons and nothing else. And there's definitely more than that. It's kind of like the animal kingdom, right? I mean, you got millions of insects, all these different species. There seems to be a
diversified,
incorporeal animal kingdom as well.
And yet it's right there in the creed. Creator of all things, visible and invisible.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's right there.
Absolutely.
It's right there. Like there's nothing about
you can't
that
dispute that.
That's anti-Christian. Yeah.
Yeah. They want it to be simple and compartmentalized. They want it to be easily fit into the box, and it just doesn't. You can't put creation into a box. It's just not going to fit.
Again, that's a reflection of the original sin. Is that the original sin of man is that we think we can understand everything.
Yeah.
Or that we seek to understand all things as God does. That's the first temptation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, there is that kind of. I think it is a fine line actually between what we do, which is wanting to discuss and share experiences around the edges of that, but without trying to claim some kind, trying to Tower of Babel-like reach for God and God's understanding. There is, it's a fine line.
Well, speaking of that sort of like trying to put things like God into a box that's neat and perfect and easy to understand, JJ, I have a question for you that I hope that you have some insight in on. Particularly, dealing with ancient languages. A question I get often, and I'd love to hear your explanation for it, is the nature of the word, the name of God, Elohim, being a plural. Now, Christianity has its sort of theological explanation for that, but I'd really like to know what your understanding is of the original Jewish understanding of that, if we even know what that might be.
So we don't know for sure what it means. Most people believe that when Judaism was first in ancient Judaism was first starting off, it was a combination of different sects that worshipped slightly different deities, whether that was El, whether that was the Tetragrammaton, whatever it may be, and then they merged together. And it was that merging which then caused Elohim, which literally means gods. I am at the end of masculine nouns does indicate a plural. Or the most common explanation that you'll hear within Judaism is that it just means that God is greater than any one God, and so therefore only a plural can reference him. However, that kind of breaks down when you bring in other monikers that he also has, whether it's the Tetragrammaton, which we don't really know how it's pronounced, whether that is Adonai, which means my God, that should be plural and it's not, et cetera, et cetera. So,
I mean, the Christian theologian, I've known Christian theologians that say, oh, it's a foreshadowing of the Holy Trinity. I mean, that's convenient, but I'm not sure that's, accurate historically. You know what I mean?
No, it's not. In fact, that is nothing more than pure revisionism, unfortunately.
Yeah, and we see a lot of that, unfortunately.
Oh, we see it all over the place. Any religion that comes along and claims to, completely invalidate the previous one by adding new dimensions or meanings to it, things are not really going to go all that well for either one of them, especially when it comes to historical understandings.
And there's just so much.
But again, I think there is a fine line there between supersessionism, if we're talking about Judaism in particular, supersessionism, which is to be avoided, the sorts of ideas and thinking and practices that certainly had an influence on the Holocaust. But also, at the same time, Christians are not Jews. And so, I tend to use the word fulfillment, the things that are spoken of in the Jewish tradition and in the Israelite texts are then fulfilled in Christianity. But there's a fine line between those two principles of fulfillment and supersessionism, and then the even more cartoon thing, which is just basically viewing something from 1,500 years before through the lens of,
Absolutely.
through a modern lens.
Well, some of it's just the carelessness of publishers to really just basically publish any radical idea that some author has, even if it's not really well researched or the person has no business even coming up with the contention. I wouldn't even dare call it a theory because some of them are so ludicrous. I remember reading one, and it still surfaces today. We've had it on this show surface, where there's this ongoing, because this book, I can't remember what the book was. It was too long ago. I was back in college, and I don't even remember the author's name. I'd know it if I heard it. But the book was basically saying that on the basis of the fact that people were trying to figure out who John the Baptist was, and some said that is he Elijah, and then I think there was even some continuation of that later on with Jesus, that this is proof positive that the early Christians, the early Jews, believed in reincarnation. And it was suppressed because the church didn't want people to know that they had a second chance after death.
Oh my God.
Wow.
And that still comes up to this day. There are New Agers out there that will absolutely say that this is why Christianity is horrible, because it's been contaminated. They've suppressed all this knowledge, and the Jewish people, they believed in reincarnation. This is the proof, and all in this one thing. It's like but that's what we see, isn't it?
They do know that there's Jews today they could ask, don't they?
Well, it doesn't help that you then eventually had
a whole midrash of knowledge anyway.
But it doesn't help that there are later developments in the Middle Ages with Kabbalah, where there are some Kabbalistic writers in the Middle Ages that start to actually delve into reincarnation. And so when you don't understand the context and you're just taking all these bits and pieces over 1,000 years of history and putting them into one contention, writing a book because the publisher says, hey, we can make money on this, and then it gets out there, and people that have had no background in any of this stuff go and read it, and they're like, there it is. I knew the church was suppressing all this knowledge. And then they gets into the secret Vatican archives, and next thing you know, you got Da Vinci Code. And it's the way it goes, And I think that is, to a degree, how archetypes play with our minds. I do think that is absolutely what's happening. But at the same time, there is an inherent authentic reality that we should be striving for. And it's difficult to do.
It gives me great cause to thank the ecumenical councils of the church and the authority of the ecumenical councils, because because as you're describing, there's a whole wormhole of things that you can expend your energies in this world, fascinated by, but are dead ends and lead nowhere. And the point of the ecumenical councils from which we get the creeds The point of it isn't to say that this is all there is. That's not the point of it. The point of it is to say this is where a Christian should expend their energies. Like the good life, the life well lived, is invested in these themes without the distractions of the multiplicity of other dead ends you can get into.
Well, yeah, and I want to second that, because it is essentially the first principles of faith, and having such lattice works and actually like strict education for those who are meant to go forth and spread the word, to have a very focused message that clearly allows for, this is permissible, this is probably, bat crap crazy, you don't want to go down that path,
right,
is so worth it. Because I mean, this is the last thing I'll say. As a kid, I happened to wind up in a particular church, I'm not going to name any names, that began teaching the most heretical concepts around angels, that everyone has a guardian angel, and if you don't happen to go into heaven, then your angel is banished into limbo and then into hell forever.
Oh, wow.
That's nowhere to be found ever. But
wow.
Yeah, I mean, but if you come from a tradition in which, now I'm not taking on any particular denomination or religion or anything else, please don't take it that way, but if you allow for anyone to have an equal voice and to be able to sway people's hearts, minds, and perhaps even doctrine, then that is kind of a very dangerous place to be in.
No question about that. Well, in our few couple minutes here, how can our audience find more about you, JJ, your podcast, all that stuff? Where's the best way to locate you online?
Yeah, so thank you for asking. So you can always find me at southerndemonology.com. It has links to all of our social media sites, our Discord server, all of that kind of goodness. We do have a very active Discord server, which anyone is more than welcome to attend. And we even have most nights we'll have Wednesday movie nights where we stream something for free and you can come enjoy it. And and otherwise, Southern Demonology is published every Monday, or as regularly as I can, at 2 p.m. Eastern, available wherever you get your podcasts, and also on YouTube. We just finished up season 3. But October 2nd, we will start up season 4 with a little revival of little mini episodes that we're going to be doing, which just talks about horror movies. So
fantastic. That sounds great. Well, I want to thank you so much for coming on this show, and we look forward to you coming back later in the season ahead to talk about Japanese mythology and spirituality.
Absolutely.
This has been such a fantastic conversation. Thank you all for having me. Everyone in chat has been so nice. I thoroughly appreciate it. And I look forward to coming back.
Well, we appreciate that.
Thank you so much.
And it's wonderful. Brandon, fantastic finding JJ and bringing him on the show. We thank you for that. Thank you.
Gold star, Brandon. Gold star.
Absolutely. Well, okay, everybody, this is the end of the summer specials. We'll be back in 3 weeks to start the new season. We look forward to spending that season with you. It's going to be really interesting. And like I said, starting off with me talking about the seduction of psychic ability and how we navigate that. Okay, we're going to talk in detail about it, 3 hours of it. So you're going to learn a lot. And I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to getting back into the seat here. I kind of miss you guys when we go on summer break. Yeah. But anyway, thank you all. God bless, and we'll see you out there in the ether. Good night, everybody.